Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. Euthanasia, or voluntary assisted dying, as it is now known, is an issue that has preoccupied Australians for many years. Between 1996 and 1997, voluntary assisted dying was legal in the Northern Territory until the federal government used its constitutional powers to overturn the laws. In the decades since, debate surrounding the legalisation of voluntary assisted dying has raged. The right for terminally ill Australians to choose the moment of their death lay frustratingly beyond reach, giving rise to trauma and heartbreak for the loved ones forced to contend with the fallout of this cruel reality. This was a reality which my next guest, Zoë Coyle, faced in her own life and which inspired her debut novel, Where the Light Gets In. Published by Ultimo Press earlier this year, Zoë's novel is a moving tribute to the inadequacies of a system which refuses to make room for a person's desire to die with dignity, the legacy of grief created by that injustice, and of the unique and enduring connection between mothers and daughters. And Zoë joins me on the podcast today to chat to me about this beautiful book. Welcome, Zoë.
Thank you so much for having me.
Congratulations on the publication of your debut novel. How are you feeling about that?
Incredibly excited. It's a dream come true, to use the cliches. It's been really exhilarating and glorious.
It's been out for a while now, and it was based on a very personal experience. I was wondering if you could tell me how that feels for you.
Sure. The book, as you say, it comes from a personal experience. My mother did euthanize herself, but the book is a fabrication. It's fabricated characters and a fabricated storyline. I actually tried to write 7 novels, and this was the first one. And then somewhere along the line I read, and I can't remember where it was, and I could never complete these other novels. And somewhere along the line I read, and it just struck me as a truth. Sometimes there's a story that you just have to honor and put out, and when you and nothing will come until you do that. So I was avoidant about doing this. I didn't really want to descend back down into a place of trauma and immense grief. And also I was worried about infringing on my mother's privacy, even though she's dead, and my family's privacy. So I very much, didn't want to write a memoir. But as it turned out, it was the exact flip, it felt for me, where it felt actually, even though it's not my mother's story, as I say, it felt like a great honoring of her and her bravery. And actually, the process of writing it when I committed to it was not dark at all. And I hope that that's in the book as well. I'm a big believer in hope and joy and friendship and love and booze and art and animals, dogs like you. I love dogs. So I hope all of that is in the novel as well.
When did you start thinking about writing this novel?
I actually had a moment. There was a moment which sounds contrived. The book is set in 3 different countries. I've been lucky enough to live in all of them. And I was living in Italy and heavily pregnant with my first child, Luna. And I was in a bathtub and I was thinking about how my world was about to change irrevocably. And more specifically about how I needed to get myself together. I mean, not that I was some crazy mess, but just that I wanted to be as well and whole as possible, so that I wasn't going to bequeath stuff through to my child, have to deal with, that sort of intergenerational trauma passed down the line. So it just occurred to me in the bath. That's an amazing idea for a novel. What happens to a woman who wants to evolve for the love of a child she hasn't met yet? And that was the genesis. And then everything exploded from there. And so in a way, the book is a kind of spiritual road trip. It's based on this young woman named Delphi Hoffman, who's 26, and she's living in London, and she's called back to Tasmania, to Australia, to help her mother die. But because of the laws, she can't be in the room and she can't assist her because she would go to jail. So that's the first third of the novel. And then the other parts are how she comes home to self, and it's an exploration of family and belonging and home. So it's so to have it out in the world, it's 2 things. 1, I feel very grateful, and 2, I feel very vulnerable and exposed.
Well, I venture to suggest that you're not alone in feeling that way. I speak to a lot of novelists, and particularly a lot of debut novelists who straddle those two worlds, really, about being excited to see their novel finally out in the world, usually after many years of working towards publication goals, and then that intense fear and anxiety about having your work publicly scrutinised.
And one of the things I love about writing is it's such a private, solitary experience, and then you send it out into the world, which of course is what you want. You want in some part of your heart or your brain to share this story. I mean, I'm very interested in storytelling and connecting. But I had to, and I'm sure this is true of a lot of writers, I had to really peg that to the very back of my brain so that I wasn't distorting the writing. I mean, of course, I wanted the reader to like it. I wanted it to be readable. I love books that are readable. And with my second book, I've had to do the same. And now that one is completed, I hate sex novels. I think there are only very few people that can write good sex. Sally Rooney is one of the few. And I've written this novel, which is a sex-soaked morality tale. And I did have a moment last week where I just thought, oh God, it's going to be out in the world. What have I done?
People I know are going to be reading this.
Yeah, my brothers.
Oh my goodness. I hear you, sister. I hear you. So you've told us a little bit about Delphi's story already. And I wanted to say that Delphi was so lost and so broken in this novel. She experienced so much tragedy and grief from, events in her life, also as a result of what happened to her mother. I could feel her grief radiating off the pages of this book in waves. Now, I don't know if this was your experience, but in Delphi's case, her mother doesn't just ask her to fly to Tasmania because she's dying, but because she wants Delphi to help her to die. And it puts Delphi in an impossible situation, doesn't it?
Yes. Yeah, it does. And part of what I wanted to explore in the novel, without sounding preachy, I wanted to ask questions rather than offer solutions. I mean, I am obviously, but I think I want to state it, I am pro-euthanasia. And I'm also pro all the legislation, which makes it very difficult to get hold of. I understand why people are worried about people being victimized in that system. But what we went through as a family, and when I speak in an I statement, particularly for me, the fact that I couldn't be with my mother when she died, I feel that that made my grief and trauma exponentially worse. It felt grotesque. It felt so unjust, and just the simplicity of, for me, it kept coming, this sort of cycle of it kept coming to, she was there at my birth, I should be allowed to be there at her death. That cycle writ large. And it felt to me as a young woman, I was 21 at the time, like a terrible personal failing on my part. I mean, obviously I was still very immature. I mean, I can see now that that's not the truth. It was beyond my control, but I carried an enormous amount of shame, really for a decade. I felt it sort of proved that I wasn't the person that I wanted to be in the world. And it was through having my daughter that I spoke about, the one in the bathtub, where actually, and I hope this doesn't sound hopelessly sentimental, where I really think her arrival helped me heal hugely, because it felt like the cycle was writ large, that in some way, I'm not religious, but I get increasingly spiritual as I age. In some way, my mother's death had made way for this child to be on earth, as I will die and make way for more children. And that quietened down this terrible shame and rage in my heart. And it allowed me to breathe and feel much more philosophical about what had happened. But it doesn't change the fact that I wouldn't want any family to have to go through what we went through. And more particularly, my mum. I wouldn't want anyone to have to die alone if they choose not to.
I think you've absolutely explained for me the kind of anguish that I read in Delphi's story. She's racked with guilt for helping or wanting to help, and yet she knows she can't, otherwise she'll be sent to prison. And that anguish for her was completely unbearable, and I could feel it in this book. In the time since publication of your novel, in Australia, we've had something remarkable happen. All the states, excluding the Northern Territory and the ACT, have passed laws on voluntary assisted dying, with some already in operation and some yet to come into operation. Zoe, how does that make you feel?
So when New South Wales passed, I was flooded with texts from people that I know and love. And I volunteered at the Euthanasia Society in London for a time after my mother's death. I wept with joy. I was alone. I was traveling for work, and I saw the first text in a corridor, in a hotel corridor. And it was like something out of an American movie. Without irony, I fist pumped the sky, and then I cried, tears of relief and joy. And I just feel so much joy for all those families out there that now have an option if that's what they want to do. And I find it really fascinating, and I'm sure you know this, I find it really fascinating that there's quite a group that apply and are given permission and then don't go ahead with assisted dying. But the peace of mind is there for them, knowing that they're not going to have a horrendous death. And when I talk to families that have had assisted deaths in their families, the words they use are so beautiful. They use words like beautiful and grateful and loving and grace. They use big words like that. And all of my words, for my experience, would be the polar opposite. I am going to say, and I hope it don't sound churlish, about time, but it's incredible.
I want to talk a little bit about some of the events in this book. And there's such a marked contrast in the way that we talk about, for example, euthanizing our pets. We say words like it's more humane, we want to ease their suffering, and that it's selfish for us to not euthanize them when we know that they're sick and they won't recover. Nowhere did you demonstrate this dichotomy better than when there was a scene involving one of the pets in this story. And I'm guessing that was deliberate on your part.
Very deliberate. And I love that you recognize that. So I wanted to have, I wanted to look at what an unsupported death looks like. So I did that through the mother character. And then I wanted to look at what a supported death looked like. And I did that through a dog. And there's actually a second dog that dies in the book as well. I mean, dreadful. I actually found those sequences incredibly painful to write. And it was to explore the difference in the psychology for everybody involved. And I tried to do it with a light touch, because the other option of, say, introducing another character or another family, or having the primary characters discussing assisted dying, that just felt so contrived and mawkish and heavy-handed. And that sequence with the dog came from, I had a beloved dachshund named Whistler, and she was 15 and she had come to the end of her life. She was an absolute mess. And my husband and I took her to our local vet, and I said, I think she's got an extra couple of days. And this beautiful vet said, let her go. You're holding on to her for you, not for her. And she literally, as we held her in our arms and sang her out through the stargates, she was wagging her tail. And then she just went heavy. It was completely devastating. It was the earliest I've ever been to a pub. We did go directly to the pub and have a whiskey, but it was beautiful. And the contrast to my mother, where I just, if I'd been able to hold her hand, or we had, it felt outrageous. It felt, I felt myself sort of tumbling over the top of myself, just trying to reconcile what a crazy species we are and the rules that we put in place. That said, I don't want to be condescending and not take into account people that have religious belief. And I deeply respect that. But the idea that the option for assisted dying is taken away from everybody because of some people's religious belief, that's not right to me.
Yeah, well said. So, as much as this book is about grief and how Delphi processes the grief surrounding her mother's decision to die, it's also about the incredible bond that Delphi and her mother Vivian shared. You're a mother of 4 children yourself. Was this something you deliberately wanted to explore in this novel?
Yes, absolutely. I love women. I like men very much too. My best friend, my husband, he's a man. But I love women. I love, and I'm going to talk in a generalization now, which I know is a blunt tool, but I love the emotional intelligence, the vulnerability, the bravery of women, the wakefulness to their lives, how much they give of themselves to their friendships, to their partnerships, to their babies if they have them. And I mean, as I mentioned before about myself, what gives my life currency and purpose and deep joy is connection. And it's why I've had 1,000 children. And I would have had another one, but my husband has good boundaries. And he said, no more. And obviously, climate disaster doesn't need any more children. Through my experience of my company, Pilot Light, so I work in leadership and I go into all sorts of organizations and I do wholehearted leadership. I explore wholehearted leadership and trauma-informed leadership. And a lot of that work is looking back at the people that helped form us. And so I am endlessly fascinated by the relationships that we all have with our parents, even if we're entirely estranged from them. And for me personally, just looking at my childhood, and I'm sure, and I'd love to hear from you too, what you felt as a parent, what you're going to take from your parents, and then what you're absolutely not going to take and you're going to do very differently. All of that I just find deeply fascinating. And in my second book, it's still, there's still mother stuff that comes up, but it's much more, my second book is based around a group of women who are dear friends. So, and I think I might be in that space forever.
We talked a little bit about how deep Delphi's grief was earlier, and its centre on a path of self-destruction in a way, a place so dark that I didn't think I would see her survive that. So I wanted to ask you, Zoe, tell me about your experience of writing this. Was it cathartic for you, or did it mirror your own grief and help you process it?
It's a good question. So I resile a bit from the idea of my writing being therapy. I'm not speaking about for other writers. I do that with my therapist. It's a creative act and a creative gift. So it was more about how do we tell this story as fully as possible? So no, there wasn't a catharsis for me. What there was, because I've done that in a different sphere, but there certainly was, and I'm not trying to obfuscate, there certainly was, I needed to go, and I referred to this a little earlier, I needed to go back into spaces that I don't want to live in, because I don't want my trauma to define my identity. And we've all experienced trauma, big T, little t. Everybody suffers. So it was really, and the older I get, the more I'm aware how brave people are, that everybody really has hurt and suffered. And I'm so interested in how do we recover? How do we put ourselves back together? And this idea of brokenness, because after my mother's death, I felt irrevocably broken. I thought that everybody who would meet me would see on my face that I was just a broken creature. And then it's not a truism, is it? That people actually, not all people, because some people are not lucky, and privilege has a part of this. I just want to acknowledge that you can rebuild. And I refer at one point to Delphi's grief being referred to as creating a cathedral inside her, a space of awe and empathy and greater love and compassion. And I certainly feel like the greatest tragedy of my life, my mother's death, has made me a better person. And by better, I mean more compassionate, more kinder, less judgmental, more capable of savoring this incredible gift of our life. And in part, I'm sure it was why I did decide to have 4 babies, why I wanted as much life around me as possible.
That's beautiful. We talked about the fact that this book was seeded in personal experiences for you, but I wondered, did you have to do any research to bring Delphi's story to the page?
That's a great question. Nobody has asked me that. That's so interesting. Yes, I did. So I did quite a lot of research around euthanasia. I set the book in 2019 for 2 reasons. 1, because the law was so close to changing in Tasmania, and 2, because of COVID. I mean, it's fascinating looking at how all the novels that are coming out now are dealing with that. So I wanted to make sure that it was as accurate as possible. Not that Delphi is an authority on on assisted dying at all, but people around her needed to be. So there was that. And then I also, so Delphi does an ayahuasca ceremony in Brighton. I did quite a lot of research for that, a lot of really fascinating reading. And then it was things like looking at climates and temperatures in different countries and so on like that. So I could try and thread it through and make it as believable as possible. And then looking at, say, the hospital system in Italy as opposed to England, just small things like the process of when you become pregnant in the UK, what happens with your GP is different to what happens in Australia. It was different to what happens in Italy. So those things, and I loved doing that.
Yeah, fascinating. So I didn't know how to say that word that you just said, but ayahuasca ceremony. I'd never read this before, and I read very widely. I'd never heard that word before. I'd never seen it. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So ayahuasca it has been used in South America predominantly for thousands of years by shaman as a spiritual tool. And it is derived from two plants that are mixed together and in a very controlled set and setting. And when I say that, I don't mean within, say, a hospital controlled, but within a religious framework. It is used, and there's a shaman and there are support people to take people on a spiritual journey of personal discovery. And the belief is that the plant shows you what you need to know. Now, there's ayahuasca tourism, so people in their droves go to these places, and I've spoken to a lot of those people, but I've also spoke to an incredible therapist who had done 25 ayahuasca ceremonies, and every time for her it was a huge, profound deepening. And she was no flake. She was a very serious-minded grown-up, and she was not reckless. She was a mother. She had very, very rigorous and fascinating views around drug taking, and thinks that drug taking to step away from self was obscene. So cocaine, heroin, to numb and to obliterate. She thinks that's a travesty. Whereas for her, plant medicine, and she put psilocybin, so the active ingredient in mushroom, in that. Interestingly, not marijuana. She didn't think that marijuana takes you towards self. She thought that was a numbing agent. But these two, ayahuasca and psilocybin, she believed were the exact reverse of those, that they bring you into consciousness, into self, into humanity. There's a lot of vomiting that happens with ayahuasca. So I don't know how on earth she did that for 25. Yuck.
Yeah, I'm with Delphi. And anything to do with emitting the contents of one's stomach? No, thank you.
I got to say, I don't like it either. Although as mothers, we've had to deal with quite a bit of that, haven't we? Ugh.
Indeed, and that's enough.
I hear you, sister. I hear you.
So if there was one thing that you would like listeners to take away from this book, what would it be?
Hope that as dark as life can be, we can all be our own agency of salvation. That was something I was really interested in too. This trope of, particularly in the heteronormative sphere, of a woman needing a man to save her. I'm really so tired of that one. And because the people that strike me as the most inspirational and remarkable, they save themselves. And I think that's so heroic. And hope, I think, is a really important and a trait, and particularly post-COVID and so on, it needs cultivating and taking care of and striving towards. And I talk about a hope experiment in the book, actually. Delphi refers to an experiment that she's read in the 60s, the rat experiment. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
that was fascinating. I wondered if that was true.
It is true. It is true. So I heard about that a long time ago. So those of you that don't know, there was a professor in the States in the 60s who put a rat into a bucket of water and then would time how long it would take for the rat to drown. Grim, I know. And it would take about 24, 25 minutes, I think, if I remember correctly, but a short amount of time. And then he would put another rat in another bucket of water, a live rat in another bucket of water, and then he would get the rat out of the bucket at about 20 minutes, give it a look around over the rim of the bucket, and then pop it back in the bucket. And that poor rat would swim on for days. And this became the hope experiment.
This book, though exploring some quite dark themes, I think you leave it with a feeling of hope.
Good.
It's
I'm
uplifting and hopeful.
I'm so happy to hear that, because I don't want to contribute to the darkness.
Mm.
There's enough out there. And I don't mean that in any twee kind of way. I see it, it's there. But as a work of art, I want to explore the darkness, but also I want to explore hope. Otherwise, it's just nihilism for me.
So, Zoe, you mentioned that you had started writing a number of novels before you started writing this one. So I wanted to ask you, did you always want to write a novel one day? Was this a burning desire that you had from a young age?
It really was. It really was. So then the question is, why did it take me until I was 40 to do it? And the answer to that, this is great. I don't know if you know it. So beautiful Ira Glass, who he's a podcaster like you, and he talks about this gap in creatives between when they start a creative, let's say writing, when they start this creative output, the gap between that and their taste, what they know to be art, what they know to be great, because generally creatives, they're in that sphere because it sets them on fire and they've read a lot or know a lot about it. And so the gap is so great that it's insurmountable, and you write a bit and your head explodes and then you stop. So for me, it was just the doubt in myself that kept me silent, or doing it very, very privately and then stopping and and then this is one of the great things about getting older. I love getting older. You just realize that's just another way to make your life small, and I want to live a big life. And so that means being daring and just going for it.
Aging does have its benefits, right?
It does, but that doesn't mean, I mean, I love that idea, which is such a truism, that being courageous doesn't mean you don't feel afraid. And that's another thing that I've learned getting older, because I always thought when I was younger, when I'm courageous, I'll feel less fear and I'll be able to do these sorts of things. I'll be able to turn up in different ways in conversations and so on. And actually then we learn, don't we? You just feel fear and do it anyway. So it is with a great, I always wanted to do it, but also I think in a way, my mother was always pushing books into my hands, but she was a terrible snob about literature and so on. So there was never any, you could do this, my darling. She was always, look at Evelyn Waugh, you'll never be as good as him. Thanks, Mum.
Dear. You can, and you did.
That's so beautiful.
Fantastic. I don't know if you know this, but there are a lot of writers that listen to this podcast. And given all of your experiences to date and the fact that this is a debut novel, I wondered if you had any tips to offer to aspiring writers who listen in.
I want to say to you that I love you. Wherever you are in your rooms, your bedrooms, if you're writing your novels in your bedroom like I was, in between moments with my children scratching at the door and me going, just 5 minutes. I want to say the two things. One, just write it. Just put it on the page. You can't edit something that's not on the page. And secondly, I read this it was really helpful for me, that writing a novel is like driving a car at night. You can only see as far as the headlights in front of you. Yeah. So that abyss of where is this novel going? What does it mean? I don't know. I'm going to peel out. Just stay there, stay there, stay there. And then for me, and I say this with immense humility, I've only written 2 books. I'm right at the beginning, but is just that glorious. It's such a privilege to be able to drop the pebble of that question, what if, into the water and watch the concentric circles just swell out, swell out, swell out. And you just follow those. You follow those. And there's the adventure. I think giving yourself permission for it to be fun is really helpful, but just don't wait like I did all those years. One wild and precious life, as Mary Oliver talks about. Write your book, back yourself.
Zoe, I wanted to say congratulations once more on Where the Light Gets In. It was a heart-wrenching yet hopeful and uplifting book about the courage it takes to heal from trauma and grief. Thank you for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Oh my gosh, thank you. I've loved it. Thank you so much.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.